Hello again, friends, and shalom, and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. I really need to just get a full minute countdown so I don't have to press that thing twice. Anyways, um, thank you anybody who is actually here after our long video we just did. We're gonna have a conversation today here with Skylar Fiction, who I'm sure many of you guys remember is one of the really you could say heavyweights of YouTube in a very serious sense. Um, I don't think I've ever had a newspaper article written about me, so very honored to have him on here. I appreciate it. Real quickly, before we do start anything, though, I want to go ahead and say to you all, shalom, of course. Thanks for being here. Please remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit this bell to get notified anytime that we go live. Get this out to the different social media platforms which you frequent. Of course, what good is a message without an audience to hear it? Also, if you want to follow me on any of those, I am on Gab, Parler, Facebook, Twitter, or Minds. Certainly would love to see any of you guys there. Also, anybody who is watching this after the fact, questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, critiques, anything like that, drop them there in the live chat below. We certainly appreciate that. And I will also have links to Skylar's channel provided in the live chat, though there is, or in the description rather, though there is no description at the moment. I actually just made this video a little bit impromptu. And what would be the last thing? I think that'd actually be just about everything because I did a lot of my channel housekeeping stuff earlier today, so a lot of you probably have already seen the video. So we'll just go ahead and jump right into everything. I am joined today by Skylar Fiction. Thank you very much for being here, man. How you doing?
Hey, what's up, my friend? How you doing this evening? I'm looking forward to this all day.
Yeah, me as well. Doing very good, and I appreciate you. For those who do not know, this was supposed to happen like 6.5 hours ago.
Well, to be fair, this was supposed to happen weeks ago, and I canceled a couple times because of tons of different things that were going on. So it's okay. We had a little late start today, which is no problem at all. Things happen in life, and it's perfectly cool. Do you mind literally? I mean, like if another date I can stream this as on my channel also, or is that a big deal?
Oh no, absolutely, by all means.
Perfect.
I actually I appreciate if you know, because basically the way I see that is you felt that the conversation was good enough to put on your own channel, or at least worthy enough to, in
Absolutely.
some way, right? So
Yeah, and that
I
way
appreciate
people too
that.
can come over and check out. If you haven't checked out his other videos later on, you can come see some of the other discussions on this channel he has. So I find you to be an honest interlocutor when we're having these discussions, something that I think I don't run into a lot these days. Not because they're necessarily Christian, but because I think some of the characters that we have on Discord and Clubhouse and stuff like that.
It can be rough for sure. So we're gonna go ahead and talk what is famously known in these circles as the Skylar shtick, right? The inspiration for me wanting to do that is you recently had a conversation with a buddy of mine, Kevin.
Yeah.
Kevin's Biblical Discussions.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, by the way, you look really good, man. I haven't talked to you in a while, but you look real healthy. You're looking like good.
Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't want to be rude and interrupt you there, but I want to say you're looking good, man.
No, I appreciate that. That actually is it's a tad intentional. I've been trying. I recently have had issues that they turned out not to be anything like deadly or anything like that or debilitating, but they're just incredibly uncomfortable. It's a nervous kind of thing. Figuring it all out, but in the process, because I was at first really worried about it potentially being like a heart or brain or something like that, I started to get a lot healthier. So
Good.
I appreciate that that's actually visible because that means it's working, right?
Yes. But we'll talk. Maybe all fair. We'll talk a little bit about it afterwards because I might have some ideas for you. Anyways, let's
sure.
Yeah.
So the inspiration for this was that conversation. I'll be honest, I didn't think the conversation went particularly well.
No.
And that was unfortunate because I like you, I like Kevin. I think you guys could probably potentially have a better conversation in the future. But nonetheless, I did want to have a question. I did want to have some questions that related to that, and I thought that you had the whole premise one, premise two, the kind of thing there. I forget what they call that, but there's a name for that.
Like a syllogism. Yeah.
Thank you.
Syllogism. Yeah, you're good.
Yeah. And yeah, so I figured we could probably talk about that a little bit. So before we do, just a brief introduction to everybody here. I'm sure a lot of people are already familiar with who you are, but just in case, who is Skylar Fiction? What's your sort of deal and shtick and all that kind of stuff? And why might we want to have a conversation?
Yeah, so I've been doing this for about 8 years. I talk to different people on YouTube, usually theists, Christians. I mean, we're open to have other conversations with different beliefs, Muslim stuff. We don't typically find them. It's kind of harder to do to get them to the room. But I just do a hit channel. Some of it's comedy, entertainment. Some of it's more educational. We do get biblical scholars on the channel. I just like to talk to people about the Bible and some of the inconsistencies that I believe are there. Not always. A lot of times it comes down to interpretation, because depending on your interpretation, you may not have inconsistencies within there. I don't like to use the word contradiction sometimes, because sometimes it really isn't a contradiction. It's more inconsistent than anything else. But that's what we do, the Skylar Fiction Show.
And so one of the big ones that is something you've brought up a lot is what you see as moral inconsistencies in specifically a fundamentalist or literal interpretation.
Yes.
Which, as it turns out, happens to be my own. So I want to kind of explore a little bit of that here. I think the common ones are going to be Canaanites, Amalekites, floods, and slavery, right? So we could kind of, I guess, pick out of a hat any of those. And really, actually, I'll let you kind of merge us into the next road here for a little bit. What are some of the, and pick whichever topic out of those you'd like, or even another one. What are some of the things you see as potential inconsistencies that you like to discuss?
So let's do, because we always do 1 Samuel. I get so tired of talking about 1 Samuel. Let's talk about women being property, bought and sold, right? Let me bring up a verse real quick here that we can talk about.
By the way, real quick, I'm going to be off camera for like
no, you're fine.
30 seconds.
Do whatever you got to do, man. No, don't even worry. I'm looking up the scripture anyways. So put this next to it. For instance, I believe this is Exodus 21. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he's to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year, he shall go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he's to go free alone. But if he has a wife, when he comes, she is to go with him. If his master gives him a wife, she is to bear and bears him sons and daughters. The women and her children shall belong to the master, and only the male shall go free. But if the male slave declares, I love my master and my wife and children, and do not want to go free, then the master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the doorpost, pierce his ear with an awl, and then he will be his slave for life. And the things that I would pick up there is a couple things. First, we have child slavery, right? The master gets to own the mom and dad's property, right? The woman was bought and sold, and also, he can give her, she can, the other thing he can do is he could give the, if he doesn't like her, he can give him to his son to be married. And we almost have in my view, right? This is a coercion, because obviously if I had children with my wife, and my master gave me the wife, I would love my wife still. I would love my children. And I feel that it's a problem where the master is like, hey, I get to keep the kids. This is a way of keeping the slave for life through coercion, I don't know, it's not blackmail. Coercion would be the best word, I guess. And that's the problems I see with that scripture, if you take it literally. It's historical narrative, yeah.
So I'll go ahead and real quick put the verse on screen just so the audience.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Exodus 21 here. And so to reiterate briefly again, you see here instances of the parents being property, of child slavery, and of a distinction that kind of makes the females like more property than the males are. So it's almost like different stages of property, kind of.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah. And the coercion there.
Yeah, right. And also the coercive aspect. So I think there are a couple things here that I think are particularly worthy of note. The first one being that I don't know, we live in a very, and we obviously modern, right? Because modern by definition is kind of present, but we do live in a world that is a lot different than the way it used to be. One of those ways that's particularly different is we tend to not have things like dowry, bride price, or the idea that the female is sort of leaving the father's house to go into the husband's house. Although we still kind of have certain elements of that, like you walk the woman down the aisle, if you're her father, right? Or typically they take the last name of the male, different elements like that. And so, in my opinion, more than this demonstrating for that element, the woman as property, I think it's more of a demonstration of that kind of a culture that we no longer live in. It's not that they're property; it's that they're more sheltered. So, shall we say? You could say that they are considered to be more valuable. And there is certainly an economic reason for that, in a sense. Obviously, women produce babies. Babies are eventually full-grown human beings, and I'm not going to pretend like the ancients didn't see women as somewhat of an economic bargaining piece sometimes, which is very unfortunate. But I think in a very serious instance, also, it wasn't always just simply economic bargaining pieces or anything like that, but was also this kind of like you're under the protection of some kind of a male. And to be honest with you, I think it's important for us to have that, even if we would manifest it maybe in a different way. Unfortunately, I think we're a patriarchal species by nature. The reason I say that is because men are bigger, men are typically stronger, typically faster, and typically more emotionally domineering, or dominating, excuse me. And as a result, to be honest with you, I think women kind of need protections from us, typically from other us who are not going to be evil. And I think that's where you end up having a system like this where the woman, it can appear, if you're looking at it in a negative light, to be more of a property element, but it also, I think, if you're looking at it in a more positive light, which I think is its intention, to be protection for females, as unfortunately a ultimately weaker vessel than we are. And I don't mean that in any sort of an insult. I just mean in the sense of like physical strength and ability to be as aggressive as men are. Does it make sense at all?
Well, let me jump in at this point. So I think the problem with this argument here is, first, she could have went with her husband, and the kids could have went with her husband, and he could have protected her. But that's not what the case is here. The case is the slave master is keeping the children and the wife from her husband. Right. So I think this idea of protection really doesn't apply to this particular situation. And also, when we're talking about morality, we're rooting, from the Christian worldview, we're rooting morality in God's nature. So, like this, like it kind of sounds like you were describing moral relativism. The morals of the cultures. It was based on the time period and the culture, based on the economic needs, all these different kind of factors, the way women were. And it kind of like we don't have an objective moral standard here then.
So not exactly. So my reason for bringing up the old cultures is only to point out that we've sort of lost this element, but I don't think this element is immoral, and that what we have is more moral. I think that the species, like I said, it is naturally patriarchal, and I think we should accept that and kind of plan around it. Like, for example, we're naturally violent, so as a result, we have cops, right? We don't accept the violence, but we understand that the species is violent. So we have cops, we have prisons, all that other kind of stuff that allows us to kind of plan around it. Similarly, I do think I think there's a little bit of a problem with the notion that we have today of like, the quote unquote strong, independent woman. And I want to be very clear when I'm saying this. I'm not saying that women are in any way lesser. I am, however, saying that I just recently saw, I won't name her, I guess, but she's a famous atheist YouTuber, talking about, the fear of men is very domineering in my life. Like I cross the street when there's a couple of men talking because of the fact that I fear men. And it's like that's unfortunate, but that is a very real thing. And I think that it is the job of other men, her father, her brothers, her husband, to be protecting against that. So it's not a moral relativism as much as it is like we used to have that back in the day. We've lost it now. And I think that that's ultimately a good thing. Not that doesn't address your other point, to be clear.
Well, no, I mean, I think it's still. You hear that noise? It's like a weird. I don't know. It's a weird noise I keep hearing. Hold but maybe it's my
It might
mic.
be my mic, to be honest.
That's all right. That's okay. It's not like overbearing. I just want to make sure. Anyways, I mean, right now, today, 1 in 4 women have been sexually assaulted, right, by men. They have reason to fear men. I don't think this was any way of. I mean, there's no. I don't think this what we're describing here is protecting women at all. We were treating them as property, and they weren't taught to read or write. They weren't taught. They didn't have any rights at all, and they didn't get to choose who they were being married off to. The father would oftentimes sell their daughters into debt. Like, I don't see this as at all chivalry or any type of protection. In fact, it even says like you can just pass them off to your son if you don't like. I don't know if it's this verse. We'd have to keep reading, but anyways, go ahead. You were going to make another point after that, so let's want to.
Well, and to be clear, I'm not saying they don't have reason to fear men. I'm actually saying because I think because of our nature as a patriarchal species, women have every reason to fear men, and that's precisely why I think we should have certain elements of like protections that essentially are traditional, as we would call them today. They're old fashioned, right?
Well, we have law enforcement. That's what law enforcement's for. I mean, that's what the cops are for, to protect. I mean, men, you can't protect women on your own. You can't even. Most men don't even have the time to be able to watch. I mean, when I was married at one point, I mean, my wife worked, I worked. It just isn't really possible these days.
Well, I mean, it is and it isn't, right? I mean, having a male companion with you most places you go. Now, obviously, I'm not saying wives and husbands obviously will separate at points in time, but kind of like you were just describing, she goes to work. Obviously, you guys aren't in the same room all the time, right? But the having like a male companion there. I mean, calling the cops is something that happens after the fact, right? The male companion there, though, is someone who's actually defending you at the time. At least hopefully, if he's a chivalrous man. And in this element here, I think it's important for us to remember the reason I'm even bringing this up is because the kinds of things that you do when you set up a system that is recognizing these inherently patriarchal pitfalls of human nature, or of human beings rather, they can look like different things depending on how exactly you're perceiving them, I guess is my point. Like, to me, a lot of these things that we look at as typically patriarchal look like protections of women, and to somebody else they might look like the women don't have as many rights.
Well, they don't have any rights.
Well, I wouldn't agree with that. I think the Bible does give us a level of so like.
Well, what would a slave girl have? What kind of rights would the slave have?
So slaves do have a deal of human rights in the Bible, right? So, for example, you can't kill them. You're not allowed to beat them in a way that provides any sort of like cosmetic damage or anything like that. Which that's the whole gouge the eye, chip the tooth thing. A lot of scholars would recognize that's not quite as literal as it's meant. In other words, it's not just chipping the eye or chipping the tooth and gouging the eye. It's more of you're not allowed to do serious cosmetic damage to somebody.
That's how American slavery was also. They had
Well,
rules to protect slaves. I mean, so it's like it doesn't take the wrongness out of slavery, right? You're just saying they had some and these are really, and be frank, you should be careful, CJ, how you talk about these things. I think it's going to come off the wrong way when you say it like, hey, they had the right not to be killed. Like, that's the bare minimum. We all have that. It's not really a right. But it's like, we all expect that people are going to kill us in a society. Sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. I was interrupting you there. And I get that. But what I mean there is like, in a lot of different, if you look through a lot of different slave codes and stuff like that, right? Basic human rights, like right to life, aren't basic in these instances, right? Now, they're basic in the sense that they inherently have them, but they're not basic in the sense that they efficaciously possess them, right? And in a lot of cultures, you could a lot of, like, for example, in Egypt, they would, in certain periods of Egypt is a long history with a whole bunch of different eras, and that can change perceptions, right? But in some eras of Egyptian history, you just kill the slave and bury him with the guy who enslaved them once he died, right? And that was even considered to be like honorable per se. I'm sure the slave probably felt very different. But so when I'm saying, when I'm looking at that kind of stuff, I'm saying like, okay, so there's a certain level of right to life that is granted to the slave that you're not always going to see elsewhere. There's a certain level of right to not be cosmetically damaged.
But you could beat them. You could hurt them. You could hurt them with a rod.
Corporal discipline certainly could happen, yes, but I don't think it would be quite at the level as we might see in other places. I think that cosmetic damage there comes into play, right? Because
you couldn't do that in American slavery either. You weren't allowed to. I mean, but that's not the point. I'm sorry to interrupt you, CJ. I did interrupt you. It just doesn't seem like the point, right? Like the point is, it isn't because it's worse other places. This is okay. Like the point is, this is immoral, and the whole argument about like it comes down to, once again, she could have went free with the husband, and he could have protected her. This whole thing about protecting women, he could have been the protector and taking care of her, and she wouldn't have been property. She would have been treated as a wife. Sorry.
Well, she would have been treated as a wife, I think, anyway here, right? In the sense of, well, I don't know. That's actually, I'll take that back because that's a little bit more of a dicey subject. Some interpret, for example, Leviticus 25 to say that slaves could have their own capital and maybe even acquire their own slaves. They were much more autonomous than we would think of slaves. Others say that that's maybe reading too much into it, and others still say that only applies to Hebrews. So I'll shelve that for a moment. We might get to it. But the reason for the rules, I think, typically are like that. So, for example, you brought up the one about like not being able to choose who you could marry, and that sounds bad. Except that we're in a situation where it's a kind of a luxury that you get to choose. And I don't actually know if you have kids or not, to be honest. But
yeah,
you could imagine. Okay, so then so for me, this is just imagination. Then for you, it would be a little bit more real, and perhaps you can even tell me where I'm wrong as a result. But you can imagine if you're living in a time, which is most of human history, by the way, right, where shacking up with the local stoner guy down the street who's a little bit of a bum, that could get you killed. Literally, right? Because he's not going to feed you, he's not going to protect you, he's not going to all that other kind of stuff, right? Whereas I can, and on top of that, you have an inheritance to potentially pass on, right? Which maybe he just squanders the whole thing, and now your grandkids don't have an inheritance or something along those lines, which is a much bigger deal back then than it is now, right? Because now if you don't have an inheritance, that's fine. You can go literally work at the local Burger King. Couldn't really do that back then. Which again, this is most of human history. So these, these things like arranged marriages, it's not only do they start to lose that sense of immorality, but you almost kind of start to look at it in the reverse, in my opinion, where it's like, man, how lucky are we that we live in a society where I'm not actually doing serious damage to my daughter by letting her marry whoever she chooses for love purposes. I mean, if he turns out to be Phil Dunphy from Modern Family, it really doesn't matter because it's Modern Family. And we have street lights and Burger Kings and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And if that is the case, well, then now it's no longer a loss of right for you to not choose who you're marrying, right? Now, I want to let you respond to that, but we do have to. I'll admit I have to get more specific with Exodus 21 here as well, but nonetheless, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean the key. I mean, once again, it might be okay. Yeah, there we go. I think the key is once again, these are property. And the only rights I've heard you articulate is not to be killed, and you can't, maim them in a way that I guess physically alters their image in some form. But like, I mean, and once again, I mean, God bans shellfish and pork and all these things, but slavery is like, it's like too much for some reason. And the reason these people are in this economic condition is because of the creation God made. God could provide all these people with food and clean water and medicine and health, but he just chooses to not to. He chooses just to intervene in the big stories that happened, like the Exodus in Egypt and things in Genesis. So like it's like we're blaming humans in a sense, like we're forcing humans into immoral positions, like slavery, owning people, because they're not helped, they're not provided for. And then God tells them, hey, since I'm not going to provide for you, I'm not going to help you. Not in those words, obviously. But he doesn't help him. He doesn't do. But then he's like, hey, well, since you gotta survive, do this type of slavery. It isn't cohesive for me.
Well, and there's a couple, and this is part of I think the great. It's an issue and it's also a benefit. It's a benefit in the sense that we get to have deep conversation. It's an issue in that sometimes it can feel like we're going on a bunch of rabbit trails. But one of the great issues with this in particular is you have to start so many different steps back. One of the steps I would take, and this is in incredibly controversial. I've gotten in trouble for it, but I do believe it. I don't think that slavery in and of itself is a moral wrong. I think how you treat slaves creates a system where slavery becomes a moral wrong. So, for example, if I if I have ownership of a person, but I treat that person like a person, right? Like, in other words, I don't like they don't have any sort of like devalue on their rights or anything like that.
Can they go and take vacations?
I think that would be something that you should do. I don't know if the Bible would say anything like that in particular, but I don't think it does. But like,
I guess my point is like, I mean, if you're basically just going to describe it like a job, it's not slavery, because treating people like with decency and paying them and having them do work is a job, right? Slavery isn't that; it's ownership. It wasn't like these people could just go do what they want; they were owned,
right.
and they literally had to do everything their master said to do.
Well, see, not, and that's where I would say that the idea of rights does come into play here, right? Because it's not quite everything. So essentially, how a lot of these, because slavery at its base is just owning people, right? And so typically, this would be, I think, kind of analogous to, and I'm not saying this is what it is, because why people are slaves you have to go into, right? But it's somewhat analogous to how felons are treated today when they have chain gangs, in the sense of like that they are the property of the state there. In fact, they're even constitutionally defined as slaves.
Oh, it is. Oh, I agree with you. It is modern day slavery. In fact,
Yeah,
our
for
system
sure.
abuses those people and hurts. Actually, interesting enough, a little off topic, but I think people will find this interesting if you ever want to look this up. That there are industries completely dominated by the prison workforce, right? To where private
Right.
businesses can't even make money because they're able to undercut them by paying them so low. Sorry, I know it's off topic, but it's something interesting people should know and look up if you want to know more about it out there.
Yeah, and it's a very interesting thing, right? And while we could certainly have, and we even could have conversations about that, because a lot of the labor violence that took place in the 30s and 40s was because of precisely that. People were getting kicked off of the job and being replaced by what essentially was slave labor, and ironically enough, very often black slave labor,
Mhm. I
which is
mean,
a
the
conversation.
Industrial Revolution was basically slavery. It wasn't
Right.
official slavery, but these things are all still immoral. We would all still stay there. It's wrong that there's no reason to believe the Jews treated these people any different.
Well, see, the thing is, in the chain gangs, I don't think they necessarily are wrong. I think they can be. Like, for example, when people were using them as an excuse to get exclusively black labor, or using them in a way that made it to where, like, you can't have people with jobs working around. But for the most part, if you have a guy who, he's got his three hots in a cot, he's got his, he's being treated in such a way that you're not going to be allowed to kill him, to abuse him, to go out and violate any of his basic human rights or anything like that, right? Now, does he have
But what is that? But when you're talking about the Israelites, what are those human rights you're referring to? Besides killing them, not being able to maim them,
Yeah.
what else are you talking about?
So there'd be a couple things. One of them, for example, when it comes to your female slaves, as far as I understand it, concubinage in the Bible is not describing what we currently think of as concubines. Concubines are sex slaves in the modern usage. Back then, they're essentially, or at least in the Middle East, not strictly Israel, but in the Middle East in general, they're more like lesser wives, but they're not actually slaves.
Well, that's they didn't have a choice in it. They're I mean, yeah, in the sense that maybe they have they're considered more wives, they have wife status, they still bought and sold with no choice of their own.
Right, and then I think that goes back to the arranged marriage thing, right? Where it's like I don't think that arranged marriage is necessarily a moral wrong. And again, there's other things that go into it, right? Where it's like that can make it a moral wrong, that can make it what we commonly perceive, right? But like, so for example, the reason I bring up the concubinage to begin with, right, is because sex slavery is just something that, at least if you take the rules at face value, not a thing, right?
Well,
You're not
no,
allowed
I
to do that.
disagree with you. I disagree with you. It is sex slavery. It's
You would
just
say
a
it's
couple extra steps, right? You just have to give them food, water, and shelter, and no other rights. You can't kill them. You
well,
automatically, by being married, are going to have sex. There's no question about that.
right, but no, there is a lot of other rights though, right? Like, for example, you are treated as an Israelite. You're no longer a foreigner. That's a citizenship right.
But what does that
You
mean
do
to a
have
woman? What does that mean to a woman? Nothing. Because you don't have any of the rights men do in the Israelite culture.
Well, it would mean that I would disagree with that. I think it would mean that you have the same. It's in fact, as far as I can tell, with the exception of some very limited things, like for example, being a priest, stuff like that. Women in Israel were, for the most part, had pretty equal rights. In fact, a lot of people have noticed that the Bible is it's somewhat how would you what was the word?
But what are those rights, man? I don't. You're still not articulating what those rights were. What could they
Yeah, well,
do? Yeah.
so like I said, one of them is being a citizen in of itself. That is obviously a big deal in these days, right?
Yeah, but
And that's even a big deal now.
but what does that mean? What can they do as being a citizen? Like what specific things can they do as being an Israelite woman?
You'd be protected under the Israelite slave laws, which only apply to, not only, but a lot of times would only apply to Hebrews. So, for
But
example, if you go
Mhm.
out, you go out with a bunch of material, right? And this is actually one of the things that's very unique about the Israelite slave code. When a slave left, particularly a Hebrew slave left, you were to give them provisions such that they would not fall into slavery again.
but CJ, it says women don't get to leave here.
Well, I guess that might be something that is an interesting thing. So I think then what we would probably have to say is that that would probably be at the behest of the slave owner, number one. But number two, I will say that that is an interesting element to add here, right? The women are obviously and their children are to be held back. Um, Now, that also is something I would kind of wonder about a little bit, only because, so if we look at the other slave laws, and this is actually something I wanted to get to earlier, but there's so many different
Please.
rabbit
Yeah.
trails, like I said.
A lot comes up.
Um,
Sorry. It's a lot
no,
to
you're
talk
good.
about.
It's
Yeah.
a big conversation. If you look at some of the other slave laws, right? Typically, you purchased female slaves for marriage purposes, though not always, right? You even brought some of that stuff up there, where it was like you can marry, you can buy the person for you, or also for your sons. And in a way, this wasn't really slavery in the same way, only because this is going to be the same thing you do with everybody else. So either they're all slaves or they're kind of not slaves. Is sort of
Yeah.
what I mean there. Like
Well,
you
remember
always
though,
give
the
them the bride
daughters
price to
here
the father.
become slaves. The kids don't. So if they have a daughter here, that she becomes a slave.
Mhm.
And then you're going to give her to somebody else, or you're going to sell her to somebody else to be married off for the money.
Yeah, right. So what I was trying to get there is that, like, so hypothetically, I
Hmm.
am, um, having a situation where I have a slave wife,
Hmm.
quote unquote, and you're having a situation where you going through the normal mechanisms. Both of us in this culture are going to be doing the same thing, which is paying the father for the woman, right? They call it a dowry or a bride price. So when you're talking about these slave laws, it is important to kind of remember this is essentially just the same thing as it is, period, right? And then it's either you're going to marry her yourself or give her to your son. And once again, we get
Hmm.
back to the subject of arranged marriage there, right? Now, the one sort of difference here would be then, I think, in that instance of instead of giving her to your son, you give her to your slave, and then obviously you have the situation here where they are kind of held back.
Hmm.
And that's where I think the argument becomes strongest for the non-Christian here would then be, is that a level of basically blackmail or something like that? And is there any
Yeah.
possibility for freedom for those people there? I would argue that there is a possibility of freedom. I'm not 100% sure. I'll just level with you. I'm not 100% sure um how to argue the point of, like, is this a level of, because I don't think it's intended to rope people into slavery, but I know that that's how it was used because human nature is obvious, right? Of course, somebody did that.
And God would
Um,
have known they were going to do that. He would have
right.
known that they were going to do that, and he still let them do it. In fact, told them they could do it.
Yeah, and I would have no issue with your saying that, though. Of course, I would want to, um, want to say that I think that there's something that might be missed there, and I'm not even 100% sure what it is. It's a tough passage for sure. But I do agree that there seems to be a very serious loophole here that, while I don't think it was the intention of the law, I don't think any rational person would say this was not done, because of course it was done, right? We all know people who would have done this had they had slaves back in those days.
I
And we're
mean,
just
the
talking
obvious answer is these people were property. I mean, that's what it's all about. They were just property to be bought and sold. They were slaves, right? That's why it comes down to this. Is that's why they're talking like this, because it's all about property rights. Hey, you can go free, right? You had a 7-year debt, you worked that debt, but you know what? I gave you a wife, and you had children, but that wife I own, right? That slave I own, and those children that slave had I own, and I get to keep them now for life. Well, I'm pretty sure life. It doesn't really tell you here, but it depends on if for foreigners, whatever going on. But yeah, I just don't think it's just. I mean, CJ, the thing is just maybe God just didn't order people to do this, right? That good, loving God you believe in may just not have said this to his people, and that would make a lot more sense.
See, I think it's that he had a specific intention in saying this. In other words, I think that there are so I am what people refer to as a Calvinist. I say it that way because I don't like the word. Calvin did not die for my sins, but that is what my theology is, right? And so as a result, my answer to that a lot of times is that, when it comes to these kind of difficult things, I do think that God actually said it. I think he intended it, and I think he had an ultimately holy purpose for doing it, although I don't ultimately always understand why that is,
Oh, so
but
you're one of the people that believe in the. I don't want to get too much off topic. But you believe in the elect, so God chooses who He's going to offer
yeah.
grace to before. Oh, come on, CJ. Come on,
Well,
CJ.
so I am just so you know, I am a compatibilist, so I do agree free will is the thing, and it is unfortunately complicated.
Yeah.
But it is, I personally, I'll put it this way: I don't
Uh-huh.
see if you take the Bible at face value, which I say at face value and not
Mhm.
literally, just so we can account for poetry and visionary stuff and all that. If you take the Bible at face value, I think it's pretty difficult to argue that it is not a Calvinistic book. That's anachronistic, of course, because Calvin died much later. But I
Yeah.
think that the Bible certainly sounds that way. You know what I mean?
I don't disagree with you there, right? I think that you probably Calvinist. Uh, well, depending on how you're interpreting, if you're taking it more literal, more like historical narrative, I think that especially when you get to Paul, which I'm not a big fan of in general, which I don't. I mean, I don't want to get. I just don't. So many Christians focus so much on Paul these days. Not you. I'm not talking about you, right? But just in general, something I've observed is I hear people quote Paul more than Jesus most of the time. And I don't know why it bothers me, but there's just something that bothers me. But let's not get off topic. I'm just ranting my personal feelings there for a second, and certainly not something I'm saying you do a lot, right? I've actually heard you talk about Jesus quite a bit. Do you want to keep with this scripture? Or do you want to go to another scripture and talk about it, or what are you thinking? You have some more
Well,
to say about this one? Yeah.
so I'll say a couple things. I think
Mhm.
so. Ultimately, I do think that the reason these rules are different does come down to a sense of protection, and I do think that a lot of these things are ultimately um, things that are either only bad if certain things occur, like I said with arranged marriage and slavery, or even sometimes ultimately good things, like I think patriarchy can be if done the right way, because we're ultimately a patriarchal species. I will concede at least one point, which is that there is a loophole here that I think is easily exploitable. I think God would know that, and I have not yet come to a proper understanding in my own view as to what exactly is the reason for that or why that's allowed in there. But I will say, I do think ultimately the intention is supposed to be, um, being fair to the person who has spent the capital as well as to the person who is the slave. I do think the Bible does try to give slaves at least a certain level of respectability and human right. I mean, a lot of people are even slaves at certain points in time, right? Like Moses,
Now I
Joshua.
haven't heard. I have. Oh, sorry. I can't.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I haven't heard those rights from you yet that are actually like specifically unique. Like we went through a couple of them. Won't killing. You can't maim them, right? And then I asked you specifics about the Israelites, and you were like, "Well, we kind of got stuck where you're like, oh, I guess you're right. With the women don't get to go free." But what was your point? So how would you counter my point about all she had to do was go with her husband and she would have had the protection? Because that's what you keep kind of bringing up that idea of protection and the men being more the alpha. That wasn't the word you used, but more the protector, the provider. Like she
Right.
could have went with her husband. Like why? It doesn't seem like that point you made really kind of overcomes that.
Well, so I think there'd be probably two main things. I think the first thing would be, they don't want to. The system being set up is trying to be as fair to all parties involved as possible, which would include the slave master there. I'm sure it could be. I don't mean to speak about people in such a callous way, but of course, if you have a man, a woman, and 3 kids, all of whom are teenagers, or maybe at least 10, um, that's a lot of capital to lose, right? 5 different people at once. And like I said, I don't mean to be callous. I'm just saying I think it's trying to be fair to all parties involved, right? I think it's trying to say, like, look, you need a certain level of rights. This person also has invested a significant amount here. We don't, and it's in a sense, it's similar to the capitalism we have today, right? Where it's like think of a football team. The athletes sign contracts that people dump hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars into. Well, even if the athlete feels like the team is doing something that's not necessarily advantageous to them, our law says we need to be fair to all parties. So we do need to respect your rights as a football player. At the same time, though, this person put millions of dollars into signing you for the next 5 years. You can't just leave, right?
There's no context where it's fair to keep somebody's children that aren't yours. They're not your children. You may have owned, owning people isn't fair in general. Okay. But like, even if I was like, okay, let's just say the woman somehow was like, it was fair that the woman was owned somehow. Let's just hypothetically, right? Like, corporations don't get to own the children of people they hire, right? Like, it's not fair to children to own them and then keep them from their father. Like that, I don't understand how you're trying to argue that's a sense of fairness, right? And you're literally arguing people as money. Literal slavery is what you're arguing for right now by saying, hey, well, these are money values. These people aren't value. They're not money. They're not property. This is why why I would call it, in my opinion, so immoral, right? And it's just, your God doesn't have to do this. He doesn't have to be like this. He doesn't have to order people and tell people they can do such heinous and immoral things, in my opinion, right? I just think that you're jumping on a sword for no reason here, CJ. Respectfully, I mean, I know this scripture means a lot to you, but I really think in your heart, I think that I don't think you feel that's right to own kids like that, like property.
Well, to be clear, though, I do think the kids would eventually go free. My understanding of the Jubilee is that once every 50 years, there is a reset of everything. Debts are canceled. Slavery is ended. The poor kind of have a little bit of a restart on their thing too. So I don't think they would be owned indefinitely. But I do understand what you're saying, right? It's not like there is a little bit of callousness when you're starting to say, okay, the financial value of losing 5 slaves at once is very big. And I freely grant that, right? But I do think even today, we still do things like this. We just make sure it's done in such a way that we're not violating certain rights. And this is why I bring up the athlete, right? Obviously, Kyler Murray, Arizona Cardinals. I don't know if you like football or not, but
I don't really watch it that much.
For sure. I'm actually wearing a jersey right now, but he just recently signed, I think, a 5-year deal with the Arizona Cardinals, $160 million guaranteed, $235 million total. He's not allowed to just stop being a Cardinal now, right? For the next 5 years, he has given over his athletic talents to them. He can retire, but even then, I mean, athletes have been sued for retiring too early. I don't know how that does in court. I'd have to look into that.
Yeah. They can't give him a wife and take his children, though.
That is a true thing for sure.
And he's being paid millions of dollars to do what he loves and he's passionate about and worked his whole life for. These slaves, it's not even a close comparison.
Well, I do think slaves were paid. I think that you can. So I'm one of those people who would say my understanding of Leviticus 25 is that slaves can acquire capital and can also own even other slaves themselves.
What are you referring to in Leviticus 25? You talking about the sojourner? Yeah.
Let's go ahead and actually look at that. That's an interesting thing.
Yeah, because I don't think that's what it's. I mean, obviously you have the Jews it's talking about at the beginning, the indentured servitude. Right. And then you have at verse 44 is when you're talking about the slaves from foreign nations. And then in verse 47 is the sojourners. Those are like hired, like those are how did we explain this before? those are like people who are foreigners that live in the land but are kind of like legally there in Israel, from what I understand. And it's talking about how they're not considered Israelites, but they're not slaves, but they're people from other countries that come to live in Israel. And it's talking about how they can also buy hired workers and things like that.
Yeah, I'm gonna try and find the exact verse here because
Yeah.
I have actually. I think now that I think about it, I've discussed this with you and Dr. Josh
I
before.
think it's 44, I think is where you want to go. I believe. Double check. I might be wrong, but I think it's.
Let's see.
Oh, no, not
Looks like
44. It's down. I think it's 48. I'm sorry. Or was it 47? I think that's it. And if a soldier and a stranger would respect.
let's see here.
I might be wrong. That might not be what you're looking for.
Well, let me go ahead and just read here a little bit, and we'll see if I find it. And then if not, I'll
Yeah.
just move on to another verse, and it'll just be my bad. We'll start at 42. They are my servants, which I brought forth out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as bondmen. Thou shalt not rule over him with rigor, but shalt fear the Lord thy God. Both thy bondmen and thy bondmaids, which thou shalt have, shall be of the heathen that are round about you. Of them shall you buy bondmen and bondmaids. I'm sure we'll probably get to that in a second. Moreover, the children of the strangers that do sojourn among you, of them shall ye buy, and of their families that are with you, which they begat in your land, and they shall be your possession. And ye shall take them as an inheritance for your children after you to inherit them for possession. They shall be your bondmen forever. But over your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule one another with rigor. If a sojourner or a stranger,
and just to clarify there, just for people in the audience, you're seeing how God treats Israelites differently than foreigners, right? The people around them, and how you can treat these slaves with rigor, keep them for life, take their children, pass their children on a permit. Even though these children are innocent, they're just innocent little children that haven't done anything wrong, besides being born, well, maybe with a sinful nature. But yeah, I mean, we're treating children like this, and God's telling you to treat children like this.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in a moment. But one thing I'll say just briefly is I think that because the question ultimately becomes what does it mean to rule over someone with rigor in this context, and I think the context is there are certain laws that pertain strictly to Israelites that do not pertain to.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what it's saying. It's saying that you can't do this to the Israelites. You can't basically treat them like slaves. You have to treat them like indentured servitude. That's really what it's kind of breaking down to. Because the Jews he rescued out of Egypt. That's what he says in the scripture. Yeah, I saved you out of Egypt. You'll no longer be slaves. But the slaves you do buy, then you can treat with rigor, ruthlessly. There's different translations, whatever. Those are the ones you have to get from the nations around you. Those are the ones you can buy the kids from and treat them with rigor. It's hard work.
Because I think a lot of people think the rigor is like you can so basically it's like you can treat these guys with a certain level of human rights, and then with these guys you can treat them essentially as we understand it today, like what happened in the South, right?
Well, not exactly.
More like,
yeah.
Well, and what I would say is I think because the laws that pertain specifically to Israelites are things like the going out and getting all the provisions when you go out, or being freed after 7 years. And I don't think those apply to foreign slaves. If I
no, the foreign slaves are kept for life, and you can be passed on as permanent inheritance, and then you can treat them with rigor, of course.
Yeah, well, I think that is the treating with rigor, in my opinion. Like, I think that is those laws not applying to them is what the rigor is. It's not that like you can kill them or beat them or anything like that. I think those laws remain the same because they don't tend to say only a Hebrew slave or something like that. But
I generally agree with you. I generally agree with what you're saying there, right? I think that, but I think it's a little bit more. But I think you're underplaying in how you're talking about how, like, you're just saying, well, you can't beat them or kill them, or I mean, beat them like mercilessly or really hurt them. Like, dude, it's the bare minimum how you treat human beings, right? You just, I don't ever. There's no context in which I beat a human being, adult human being, and I don't even beat my children. I wouldn't even beat kids, let alone an adult human being. There's no context where that's moral to do, right? Like,
but surely you recognize that's a very, and don't get me wrong, I am glad to live in 21st century America with you, where corporal punishment is a thing of the past and stuff. Like I'm happy that I don't have to go through this kind of stuff. But it is a little, how do I put this? Like we're looking at here at the past and we're saying, it was only 50 years ago that you could spank a child in school. Like the teacher could spank the child, you know what I mean?
A lot of
I think
psychological damage comes from that too, man. There's a lot of damage psychologically that will come from that. And I think we're dealing with some of it, dealing with some of these baby boomers and how they act and how they treated their children. Right. And I think it's a huge problem. I mean, anytime you're using physical harm and intimidation to try to change someone. And when you're, especially with children, if you don't think it's a shit, just yelling loud enough sometimes can really wreck a child. And what's, I mean, look, you just watch that video on Jeffrey Dahmer. And what do you say? Your parents weren't ever physically violent with each other. They just argued and yelled and screamed at each other all the time. Right. And he was a sociopath also. Anyways, go ahead. I interrupted you. I apologize.
You're fine, man. You're totally fine. This has been a good conversation. And I think there's a level of truth to that and a level of non-truth to that. I think a lot of it depends on context. I won't go into details, but I have certainly been on the side of what we would call abuse, and I've been on the side of what people would describe as physical discipline. And I can say, at least from my own experience, there's definitely a difference. Like there's a level of, okay, I deserve this, I respect my dad for what he's doing, kind of thing, versus like, wow, like this person is like a threat to me. You know what I mean?
Well, I want to take it. Listen, I know that's something personal. I don't want to take it. I want to take it out of that realm, right? But I think also you got to be careful because a lot of times, it's a subjective type thing, right? How you deal with it and someone else deals with it can be very different. And also, like, I don't, is it called Munchausen syndrome, where when you start defending your abuser? And I'm not saying your dad abused you or anything like that. I'm just saying that, like, there is situations where people will start to defend the people that, even though they're violently hurting them or something like that, they start to defend those actions and think that they're doing it for the right reason, even though it just isn't appropriate to do it all. But that's just my opinion so far with it.
Well, and I certainly appreciate it, and it's another, that's the thing that makes, I think, this conversation so difficult, right? We're talking about a lot of things. We're talking about owning people as property, but we're also talking about corporal discipline. We're also talking about, arranged marriages, patriarchy, right? Like there's so many elements that go into discussing these kinds of laws that it can be kind of a little convoluted at time, right? One thing I would ask though, because it was, I think you've been fairly clear that you don't think spanking is effective. So it was also not that long ago. In fact, it may even still be a thing. I'm not 100% sure, but you could corporally discipline soldiers. And I think you can corporally discipline prisoners as well, although that might also be a thing of the past. But certainly, like within our parents' lifetime, well, to be fair, you might be old enough to be my parent. I'm pretty young.
I'm about 4. I don't know, man. I'm thinking I'm a little young. I'm 43, so I'm not that
43.
Old. Yeah,
well,
maybe.
That would
if
be
you're in your early 20s.
Yeah.
If I had my kid young.
Yeah,
you're definitely right about that, though. There are, military students, and actually, in a lot of Buddhist monasteries, they still do it. Like when they're studying discipline and things like that, it's part of the culture, right? I don't know how I feel necessarily about that. I think that if someone signs up for it, like if someone's like, hey, this is going to happen, and it's going to happen, and you sign up for it, I think that is a little different of a context to it. I just think with children, it's it's just not necessary. I mean, dude, I got 2 kids. I don't have to. Honestly, it's just about talking to them, and it's a good start is always a good start, right? A lot of people don't have that fortune, right? They're not lucky enough to have 2 parents or have a home that has a stable household, and it's already kind of starting on rough ground. And then later on, when you have parents who don't, I didn't have my first kid till I was 31, right? So so I was a little older, a little wiser, right? Still growing. I wasn't the best parent in the world in the beginning, but you start to learn. It gives you a little bit more patience. Like it's hard, man. People don't realize how hard like young children are because they don't do what you want in a sense. Like they, you think it's a bit. When I had this weird imaginary idea in my head that like I would just hold the baby and the baby would just sit there and be calm, and I would just that's not, babies move around, don't want to sit still, they cry, they do anything. Anyways, let's keep going. But anyways, you continue with your point. If you're I do gotta say your audience is hilarious, man. Some of these folks in here are some of the comments, man. Someone called me a what they call me oh, so funny. They said I was a snowflake for not beating my children.
Well, and look,
Anyways.
I'll say, like, the ultimate point I am kind of getting at here is that I
Yeah.
do believe that a lot of these things are things that can be problematic, but aren't necessarily so. So, like, for example, corporal discipline.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's effective. I think that it can go into abuse, certainly. Like, for example, I think somebody who spanks their child is significantly different than somebody who like slugs them, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I can even say too in the case, and I probably shouldn't do this because it puts you in an awkward position where you have to
Yeah.
judge my life.
Okay.
But
I
anecdotally, I'll
won't.
do it one more time. Anecdotally,
Yeah,
I
it's
will say,
okay.
my dad was always quick to like explain, like, look, this isn't like something that we're doing because we're having fun or something like that. Everybody's heard the whole "it hurts you more than it hurts me" kind of thing. I largely think it's true in a way, to be honest. Like, it is probably emotionally harmful for a parent to see their child in pain, you know. Um, but I do think it works. And if you look at, like, for example, militaries were more disciplined in the past. Prisoners had less of a what is it, recidivity or whatever, when they go back into prison in the past.
Mhm.
We didn't have things like school shootings in the past. There
Oh,
it does
yeah.
seem like this stuff worked, and the less we get from corporal punishment, the more we do have a more undisciplined military, and children do kind of seem like. And again, that is even with recognizing, I think that there is a difference between some people take it too far for sure. Some people like got rings on and punch their kids in the mouth. That's not
I
okay.
think you're making the wrong connections here, right? I don't think the reason we have more school shootings is because we don't spank children more often. I think the reason we have more school shootings is we have much easier access to dangerous weapons. First is one thing, right? Secondly, because of the economics of America, both parents most of the time have to work 2 full-time jobs, right? Because we don't have a government that provides health care or does anything really to help poor people, or in a lot of ways. It's so hard to get any of these social programs going, right? So you have parents either working full time, or we have large parts of our population where their fathers are in prison. In general, we have 25% of the world's uh, uh, prison population, yet we're 5% of the world's population. 5% of the world's population, 25% of the total world prison population, right? So we keep locking up uh, a lot of dads, right? These kids grow up without fathers. We have poor mothers that now have to work full-time jobs. We can't do anything, right? Um, we don't have a lot of programs for youth and things like that. And it's just very well, there's a lot of reasons, right? And I don't think corporal punishment is. The other thing I'll tell you is uh, when you talk about, like I said, it's one thing when you're talking about. Well, I was going to ask you: is there something you could feel comfortable telling why you got a beating for? Like, is there something particularly that you would feel comfortable saying?
Oh yeah. So I was an older brother. So
Mhm.
as most older brothers do, I could bully my little brothers sometimes, and sometimes it is a little physical. Like I've certainly slugged them a few times, and
Sure.
so that would be. I think that's probably the most common thing I ever got spanked for. Although my spankings were not common, to be fair.
No, that's
Uh,
good. Well, yeah, I would just say that there's always what I find is I've never run into a situation with my children, right, where it wasn't something I couldn't articulate or explain why there was a particular rule.
mhm,
Right? Does it mean they're gonna follow the rule all the time? Absolutely not. Right? I have to do all kind like take away tablets. My son was easy. I just put him in timeout all the time. My daughter is a different monster that I have to deal with because she's more like me. She's literally me to a T.
right.
So like my son is more like my son is all the good parts of my patience and my calmness. He somehow got all, and my daughter, who's a sweet little girl, don't get me wrong, she's not a bad girl, very sweet,
Mhm,
loving, but she's rambunctious, right? She pushes limits on things. And when she gets mad, I've got to learn not to react. A lot of times parents like react. They match the level, right? And
mhm,
you've got to just at some point there comes a moment where it's like you ain't gonna calm her down at the moment. Like it's just not gonna happen. There's nothing I can do with spanking, timeout. It's just you have to walk away, wait for that person to calm down. My children never throw fits in public or anything like that. But I always found there's always a way that you can do things. But this is one of those things. I think studies. I think when you look at the studies on how the negative effects of spanking and stuff like that, it has large mental effects on children. And I really don't think it's effective in the end. I said, but I can understand your point in context with adults, and maybe there are some contexts if they sign up for it where physical discipline, like I said, the Buddhist monks do it. There could be some reason.
And let's remember, with slaves, there is that law about cosmetic damage. Right now, I keep referring to it as cosmetic damage. Allow me to explain for the audience's sake. What it says is, you shall not gouge the eye or chip the tooth of your slave. And now I'm not typically on board with most biblical scholars per se. I'm a fundamentalist after all, right? But most biblical scholars do say, and I tend to agree, and the reason I tend to agree is because they can demonstrate it with other slave laws as well. This is a common thing. This is not meant to be hyper literal. In other words, it's not saying only don't do these things. It's more like you cannot beat them in such a way that you're causing like serious cosmetic damage. For example, gouging an eye or chipping a tooth. Something that, you don't have dental work in these days. You don't have visionary work in these days, right? It's not like this is going to be a big deal if you do something like this. And so it's almost like they are creating a line of demarcation between what they would call physical discipline and abuse, right? Now, where exactly that line is, to a certain extent, we have to read into it because it does word it the way that it does. But I think recognition of that line does at least tell us that the Israelite culture, or, obviously you would say the Israelite culture, I would say God, right? But nonetheless, that they had a certain understanding of like, hey, these are people. We shouldn't flagrantly abuse them. And I know a lot of people say, well, some states in the South had this. Some of them did, certainly. But I think all of us have seen plenty of the pictures with the guys with like massive gouges in their back to demonstrate that certainly was not what was being practiced in all states, right? I think certain states tend to be a little bit nicer than others. The Deep South in particular is where stuff got really rough, which, there's socioeconomic reason for that, but none of it excuses anything. The point is just to say, that famous picture, you ever seen the famous picture of the guy? He's looking like this and it shows his back and it's just like all sorts of. Yeah. That, if we just take the straightforward reading of what the Bible says, that appears to me to be something that would be grounds for him to be free. Because remember, if you cause the serious cosmetic damage, the slave goes free.
Well, remember though, this isn't consensual though. These people don't want to be beat. That's the key. Is that and actually, if we look at what is it, Exodus 21, where we talk about where if the slave dies. I'm trying to pull it up real quick now. Exodus 21. Where is it? Because there's actually scripture about what you do if the slave dies. Exodus 21:20.
Yeah.
Exodus 21.
Here real quick.
Yeah, it's let's see here. Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. But they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. So you can beat them, like they're not to be punished. You're not to be punished if you beat them and they don't die. But you could literally beat them to the point, and I'm not saying they all did this or anything, but I'm just saying under the law, you could beat them to a point, and as long as they don't die, you're not to be punished because they're the slave master's property. And this is how American slavery worked the same. You weren't allowed to kill your slaves in American slavery. And you could beat them, but if you killed them, you were to be punished.
So I'd say yes and no, right? And what I mean here is you do have to take into account the laws with each other. Now, there's different understandings of this. I will grant you, not being a Christian, don't have the same necessity for the text to be consistent as I do. So that's, I'll grant that and say that it is entirely possible that this is two different narratives, like the documentary hypothesis would say. I obviously disagree with that, but it is possible this is two different narratives, and that's why they appear to contradict. I think it's more likely that this law needs to be taken into account, and other laws also need to be taken into account, right? So here we obviously see, if a man smite a servant or is made with a rod and he shall die under his hand, he shall surely be punished. It is important to note that word there, punished. This isn't universal, but a lot of people think that the usage of the word there, I think it's nechar, indicates a death penalty. Which, if that is the case, that's high value on the slave's life, right? You kill him, we kill you, kind of thing. And maybe I don't know, obviously, whether or not you disagree with capital punishment isn't here nor there. The point is just to say they're clearly putting a large level of value on the slave's life there, right?
Well, it's about property. It's not about. I wouldn't say they're putting a huge amount of value, because if they had value on the slave's life, they wouldn't be being beat in the first place.
Well, I think that would take us back to the question of corporal punishment, right? Which is possible. Obviously, we'd have different understandings of what constitutes bad corporal punishment. But if what the Hebrew scholars not all of them, the Hebrew scholars I'm referencing here, though, if what they say is correct about that word punished indicating a death penalty, then what this text is saying is if you kill your slave, you will also be executed. Which is
murder.
Yeah, exactly. Which that would be that's a pretty high level of value on the slave's life, in the sense that you are saying he is a person under the law, just like you are. He's not just your property.
Anybody who murdered somebody would be punished with the death penalty under those laws.
In Israelite culture, that's true, but not in all others. Like if you look at the Code of Hammurabi, for example,
sure, but we're talking about the Israelite culture. Yeah. No, right. I get. Yeah, no, but we're talking about God and the Israelite culture. So it's like there's no difference here. It's just they're following the same law of murder under the Israelite law, which is right. If anybody who murders somebody is executed.
Right, but what I'm saying is that demonstrates a certain level of value that's being placed on the slave's life that's not found in other cultures. For the most part, you really could kill a slave.
That's not true. I don't know about that, and I don't think that's relevant. What other cultures do is not relevant to God's morality and what He tells the people they can do under His moral system.
Right. Well, and then there's a level of truth to that too, I think. Let me see if I can find. Yeah, here it is. But remember, this is the same chapter, so it's very likely that this is meant to be taken as consistent with what we just had. It says, if a man smite the eye of his servant or the eye of his maid that it perish, he shall let him go free for his eye's sake. And if you smite out his manservant's tooth or his maidservant's tooth, he shall let him go free for his tooth's sake. Mm-hmm. The point here just kind of being, so that previous one was talking about, okay, you're only punished if they die. But just a couple verses later, it's saying, actually, that's the way that is worded is not meant to be 1,000% literal. In other words, you are punished if they die, but also if you cause this serious cosmetic damage, you are also punished in the sense that the slave goes free, right? Which I think, again, I don't want to be too overly callous about this. I am sitting up here with my jersey and my coffee on my internet, right? I'm very blessed, but that is a pretty huge deal for the slave owner. You just lost your free labor. You know what I mean?
Well, it's their property and they're bought. It's not really free.
Well, I guess that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, think about why, a slave with maybe one eye might be useless, or if they don't have teeth, right? You're talking about they're going to have serious issues eating, right? Back then, especially food. I'm sure these people's teeth didn't last very long. I can imagine how people without teeth back then, there was no dental care or things like that. The life expectancy. It's just not good treatment, man. There's no way to argue this is all good treatment of slaves. There's no real rights. They don't have any. They're property, and basically all we're arguing here is that the minimum: don't hurt them and kill them. Like, you shouldn't do that anyways.
Well, don't get me wrong. I grant that you shouldn't do that, but I think the point does still stand that there is, there are certain rights here that we would assume don't apply to slaves, but in the Israelite culture they do. In the Israelite culture, you do. If you're causing this kind of that, like I said, that picture with the guy with his back all cut up, if you do that, that slave's going free. If you kill him, obviously he's not going free because he's dead, but now you're going to die too.
Well, you don't want to damage your property. It's a property issue. Like, you lose your property, you lose your money. What is up with this weird guy in the audience, Saint Beloved? Skylar is proud supporter of mothers killing their own kids.
That's probably a reference to abortion, but aren't you pro-life?
Yeah, I am pro-life. The irony, that's what I find sometimes. I wonder about people and their judgmentalness and not just asking. And use some of that stuff Jesus taught you there, Saint Beloved, like what he told you about charity and being kind to others and not persecuting others. Just saying. I didn't think about that, CJ. That's probably an abortion. Not that we're even talking about abortion or any of those topics right now.
That's true, but for the record too, I will actually I will defend you on this aspect because I always thought it was fairly um, consistent of you, actually, considering some of the issues you bring up that you have said you're pro-life. I know it's probably not the same per se as like an abolitionist or something like that, but
Yeah, no. Yeah, the thing is like the only problem is, and I wish there were more, because I typically don't vote for Republicans, right? There's not a lot of Republicans I would vote for now. There's a couple if they would get like General General Mathis, like the one who was the Secretary of Defense under Trump. Like
Mad
if
Dog,
that man, Mad Dog. If that guy ran for president, I'd vote for him in a second. The guy's got honor. He's smart, intelligent, like he wants to work together. There are a couple I'll vote for, but I wish, the Democrats used to have more pro-life candidates back in the day, but unfortunately, this has become such a polarizing issue between the two parties that you don't get, but we'll see. We'll see how things go. I'm always hoping. I'm always I tell my friends, and I'm not, I said, it's one of those things where, I think people need to discuss it more. People need to not be so antagonistic with each other about it, right? If the goal is to lower the amount of abortions and we all want to do that, I'd hope, then we got to work together and we got to figure out ways to do it. Anyways, let's get back. I'm sorry.
No, you're totally good. To be fair, while I'd have obviously an opposite version of that, voting typically Republican, I feel the sentiment. I support marijuana legalization. There's very few Republicans who support that. I think it's ridiculous to have 700,000 people in prison for smoking a plant. It makes no sense.
DeSantis here in Florida, we have medical marijuana, right? And we voted on it in our state to get it, to change our constitution. I think it was over 60%, because you have to get over 60% in Florida to be able to change the constitution. And they instantly tried to ban it. Like they instantly tried to make these dumb rules. They didn't let you have flour. You could only get vape pens, which is way worse for you than having just natural flour. Then they then they only let millionaire, like you had to have $1 million application fee in order to open a business. They added new regulations to lower the amount. So this is even a guy running for president. It's going to be running for president, and they're still trying to fight. I don't even get it, because they would be smart, and then the Democrats are going to beat them to it. Finally, it looks like they're finally going to do something about it. All right. But it struck a kill, because I agree with you. There are things where I don't understand it. I used to be a registered Republican. Now I'm independent, but it's just like I don't feel like the party is the same party as it was. I was more of like a Ron Paul libertarian type guy. Actually. Yeah, I really liked Ron Paul, and I like that he challenged some of the ideas in those debates back in, was it 08? I think it was 08. I think it was 08 and
actually 2012 too. He ran twice.
Oh yeah, he did a great job. He's a little older too. But what was funny though about Ron Paul is they all mocked him in 2008, and by 2012. They were, they gave him a lot more credit during those debates. All of a sudden, their positions were changing much more to what he was talking about with some of the war stances. But
and also, obviously, we'll get back to the topic, but I do just want to say, Trump certainly does not agree with Ron Paul, but it has been noted by a lot of political historians that it's hard to tell because we're only 10 years removed from his own run, and then Trump was just president a couple years ago, but. Trump kind of rode the wave of Ron Paul in a very similar way to how Biden rode the wave of Bernie Sanders, even though neither of the two agree with the people whose waves they rode.
Yeah. He benefited from the Tea Party a lot more. Yeah. All right, let's continue. Yep.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, it's okay. No, you're fine.
So the point here, though, to reiterate is just to say, like, I think what we have in these two laws are basically like a very serious limit on what corporal punishment can be. I would probably, obviously it's not literally spanking, because I mean, just imagine spanking a full-grown man. That'd be hilarious. But I think it's similar to that. I don't think this is like things that are drawing blood, breaking bones, stuff like that. I think that the corporal punishments are meant to be.
Well, you're beating with a rod. A rod is a pretty heavy. It's not even a belt would be less painful than a rod will.
It certainly depends on the rod. I think a lot of rods are like, so for example, in Myanmar, you have a system where they will take these, they're like bamboo rods. And if you keep using them over time, they will splinter, and then that as a result cause much more damage than they would initially. But while you have the rod kind of fresh, so to speak, um, it's a stinging pain, but it doesn't like damage you in such a way that you start to be like, broken bones or anything like that, or serious like trauma to the back or head or anything like that. Um,
And by the way, I just found out. I was just going to Dr. Josh messaged me. I guess he's watching and listening, but he was telling me that it was the. I mean, this is the same in antebellum slavery too. You could discipline your slaves with things. There were rules to how much you could beat them, like how hard you could beat them and stuff like that. Now, were they enforced? Yeah, but we did have laws for them to protect it. Anyways, do you have a because I brought up 2 verses. There's something you want to be. I know I said 10, but we'll go a little longer. It's fine. Do you have something you want to bring up topic wise, or a particular verse I usually go after? I want to give you time to maybe throw something at me, since I've thrown 2 pretty. Well, we've been going about slavery the whole time, and I've been pushing it.
well, so yeah, I think there'd be a couple of things here. I think one thing I would want to bring up. So you have syllogism that you talk about where you're like, you go down the system of like, God can't do stuff against his nature and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah, you want me to read it? Do you want me to go through it, or I have it? If I have it
yeah,
up.
let's put it on the screen. Might as well, right?
Yeah, hold on. Let me see here. Where is it? There you go. Okay. I'm gonna read it for you if that's all right, because I don't want to have it. It's not good form. It may not be perfect. So let me do this. Hold on one second.
Well, by the way,
quick,
now that I know that, what's up, Dr. Josh? Pleasure having you.
He shouldn't. I always try. Yeah, he probably should be in bed. Let me see here. Okay. So usually so the premise 1. Now keep in mind, I gear this towards the Christian folks, and I am, by the way, people. I don't think people know I'm a God believer. I'm not an atheist. If you don't know, just don't believe in the same type of God. But anyways, understand this. If I were writing this in general, I would have to put something like right here. God's nature is the root and foundation of morality. But if this was a real syllogism, that'd be like, if Christianity is true, then God's nature is that. So you'll understand when I say that I'm shortening it for the sense it's easier just to go right with the Christian understanding. And that's not going to be anything I'm sure CJ is going to object to. So premise 1, God's nature is the root and foundation of morality.
Yeah, and I think that I actually think that right off the bat becomes a question, because I'm not convinced that morality per se is a reflection of God's nature per se. It's a complicated issue, but suffice it to say, I'm a divine command theorist. I think morality, from the perspective of the human being, is more what God has said. And then there's the question of why God has said what he's said, which I don't think we're necessarily privy to. But my reason for this, there's a couple examples. The first one I'll use is murder, and the second one I'll use is accepting worship. The Bible is very clear about accepting worship, right? That you shouldn't do it, basically, because you're not a god. Obviously, you have the first and second commandment, but then there's also, when John tries to worship the angel, or when the people try to worship Paul and Peter, and they say, don't do that, worship God alone. So that would put you in a little bit of a conundrum if you think that morality is a direct reflection alone of God's nature, because of course he accepts worship. So it's not that we shouldn't accept worship because he accepts worship. In that sense, it's we shouldn't accept worship because that's a how would you say this? That's like something that belongs strictly to God.
Well, I agree with you, and I think that's why it is immoral by his own nature, because God's nature is the only one worthy of worship. And the opposite of being worthy of worship would be someone trying to take credit for it that is undeserving, in a sense. So I think that would be a rooted foundation. If he's the only one that is worthy of worship, the opposite of that is worshiping somebody else, because there is nobody that is worthy of worship under that thing. And then the other problem you run into with divine command theory, I mean, you still would probably have to root it in his nature, because if not, if it's just he's creating morality from his mind, like he's deciding what right or wrong is, then it's something separate from him, or not even separate from him. It's a creation of his. instead of him being the standard and being the good.
Yeah, and it's a little complex, I'll be honest, because in a sense that's true, especially when you start to talk about like the incarnation. What Jesus did is what we are supposed to do, although in that instance there's still the issues of authority, like he does accept worship and things like that, right? This is one thing I think that becomes important when it comes to the aspect of taking life, because the Bible talks about, I, the Lord, how does he word it? It's in Isaiah 45, but I kill and make alive. I create the darkness and the light, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
The idea kind of being that God has the sole authority to take and give life as he sees fit. Now, he's given that authority to us as far as giving is concerned, in the sense that he allows us to procreate. And in certain elements, he's given us that authority as far as taking is concerned when it comes to capital punishment or when it comes to warfare, although that's a dicey one, obviously, because not all war is equal. Sometimes you're fighting the Nazis and sometimes you are the Nazis. But the point there being that when it comes to something like, for example, taking life, I don't think it's necessarily true to say we don't take life because it's against God's nature to take life. I think it's more accurate to say we shouldn't take life because God has sole authority to take life, and not man.
Well, I think it's two things, right? I think you're right to a certain degree. I think it's about unjustified killing. And of course, you're going to argue all killing is justified by God, right? But I would say that really the more moral contradiction I would find is his methodology, right? And that's where I think the real problem lies. It's not that he just didn't, take the lives of babies or whatever. It doesn't matter. Children, we don't have to say babies. And people that we might view as innocent, children or babies, okay? It isn't that he just, if he'd taken the souls out peacefully, I don't think we'd have a problem. But the problem is how he orders people to do it. And it's very violent back then. Obviously, through warfare, they're going to have to use a sword or some kind of weapon like that. And also, it's making a soldier do something like that, right? When he could have not had the soldier go through that pain and suffering. And you're well aware that soldiers come back from the military, from Iraq and stuff, don't have to particularly target children or women, things like that. And they come up still really having to deal with PTSD for years and years and years, right? When literally God could accomplish the goal he wanted to. And like I said, you could, if you really wanted to punish the adults, like the adults were doing something really wrong or they were doing bad things, maybe I could see some justification. I'll be fair. Okay. But it's really hard for me to find the justification for the way he does things violent to children. And I think that's where the loving contradiction kind of comes in.
Yeah. And so there's now real quickly, I do want to say almost as a way to give you a little bit more fuel. Probably shouldn't do that, but I'll do it anyway.
That's why you're a fair guy, though. You're an honest interlocutor, right? I don't have to worry about you lying or trying. I think I think you just genuinely want to think about the issue and discuss it. So I appreciate it. Obviously you don't have to add fuel to the fire, but I appreciate you just being very open and just honest dialogue with it. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, and I do appreciate that tremendously. For a couple of reasons. Number one, I do want to be fair to you guys. I want to be fair to the audience, all that kind of stuff. I want to objectively pursue the truth. But also, if hypothetically, let's just say for the sake of argument, I converted you to Christianity. Well, I wouldn't do that if I was being unfair about it, right?
Absolutely.
You just sit there and be, oh, well, CJ's dishonest, just like the rest of them I talk to, right? And not to say that everybody else is dishonest. I'm just simply saying that can be the perception.
No. In fact, I think I think honesty is one of the best policies you can have with this kind of stuff. And of course, like once again, before you respond, I always say this to other Christians. I'm not trying to say that your God did these things, right? I'm just dealing with the interpretation CJ has, right? We've talked a bunch of times, so I'm aware of what CJ's positions are. And if they've changed, he'll tell me right now and he'll explain what's going on. For me, if I were a Christian, I would look at these passages as not written by God, not inspired by God. I would be like, this is men trying to get things done through war, and they're telling their people that God is on their side and he wants them to do it. So that I just to be clear, that's where I would be as a Christian. But I'm dealing with CJ's position here. Go ahead, CJ.
Yeah, and so my little fuel here I'll add is I think the Bible even kind of in a roundabout way acknowledges the PTSD of soldiers in that, if it's spoken in Joshua. I don't remember, it might even actually be um Joshua, it might be Deuteronomy, but one of the laws talk about how if you execute, or if you kill somebody, not execute, but I mean same thing, right? If you kill somebody in warfare, you are outside of the camp for a week and you cleanse yourself. And while it certainly is a ritualistic cleansing and also just a sanitary thing to make sure there's not diseases going everywhere, a lot of people have long pointed out how beneficial it would be for soldiers to basically group together with the rest of the soldiers who have taken life for a week in a way of like kind of unwinding from the horrors that you yourself have now been involved in, right? Like for example, Richard Gabriel has talked a lot about that, talking about how like this is really a primitive form, don't get me wrong, but a primitive form of kind of
Therapy.
counseling in a way.
Well,
Yeah, therapy, exactly.
But an unnecessary one, because you wouldn't need it if God didn't make you do it in the first place.
Yeah, and so then that immediately that's where the question then arises, right? Is this what's the point of all this kind of thing, right? I think there's a couple of things. I think the first thing is it paints a very vivid picture of just how seriously God judges sin, that he's willing to wipe out an entire culture in a very brutal fashion, and he'll even go out of his way to say, he says kol hanishama, everything that breathes, the goats even, in other words, right? That's basically God's communication of like, I take this stuff very seriously. It is detestable, and which you wouldn't get with a more peaceful kind of thing, right? In other words, the very fact that you're asking this question becomes part of the point. Why is it so brutal? Because that's how God sees sin in such a way that it really is this brutal.
But the children didn't do it, right? Like if he could do that to the parents, right? You could still show that with the parents. These children were only just simply born with a sinful nature.
Don't get me wrong, that is true, but I think that again, it's not so much the effect of simply getting rid of the sin as much as it is also the effect for us who are reading it, seeing that, because you don't have the same level of, man, that was really rough, if God isn't killing the goats and the children and the elders, right?
Well,
like,
I disagree.
It becomes part of the point.
I think that if I were to read that story, right, and it said in the beginning it was like God mercifully took all the children in the night to heaven, took their souls out, but then for the adults who had done all the evil, who had sacrificed their children, who had raped these women, right? God came in and mercilessly caused them pain and suffering, and they died and went to hell. Like I would read that story and be like, "Oh my God, look at how merciful He was for the children," right? And then look at also how I don't want to mess with this God. I don't want to do wrong by this God because I see what He did to the adults, right? I think that I don't see how hurting the children. I think it only causes you problems because no one. I mean, most of the time, I shouldn't say no one. Right. Most of the time, even as a Christian, like people struggle with it. This is one of these passages where Christians are just like, I don't know. Like most of the time they're like, I don't know what God's reasons for doing this is. It doesn't make sense to me. I feel it. That doesn't feel right necessarily, but I've just got to trust God and what He's saying. I don't know if I buy it, CJ. I get what you're saying, but I think it's a tough argument to make that it's just to show His power. I think people already knew. He already flooded the world. He'd gotten the people out of Egypt. Let's go ahead. No, please.
Well, let's remember though, it's not simply. First off, this is one in a list of bullet points I'd put out, but it also let's remember, even in what I'm saying, right? It's not the demonstration of power per se as much as it is the demonstration of severity, right? Because the very act of a lot of people, you particularly focus on the children. I've had other people who like to focus on the animals because animals obviously are not morally culpable for stuff. But what both of you guys are basically saying is like, man, why is it that harsh? That seems capricious. You know what I mean?
It's unjustified.
See, and in my opinion, I think that's precisely one of the points of this idea of like you're supposed to feel that way. You're supposed to look at this and come to the conclusion of like, man, God does not play around in the slightest.
But that's
It's
not the
like,
conclusion I come to. I come to it's unjustified and cruel.
one,
Like,
I
in
think there
fact,
are very,
how many people have you run into that actually? I'm sorry to interrupt you. I mean, how many people do you run into that actually like think and view this as a positive thing?
I'll be actually, it's funny about that. This is one of the things that has led me to be Reformed or
Mhm.
Calvinistic. For those who don't know what that means, it typically, for the most part, outside of Reformed circles, not many.
Yep.
Some traditionalist Catholics, some fundamentalist Baptists. The fundamentalist Baptists, unfortunately, can sometimes get a little crazy. Which, no disrespect to Steven Anderson, but also all the disrespect to Steven Anderson. Anyways,
It's pretty crazy. Yeah. Is he still around? Is he still doing things, Stephen A? I thought
uh,
I don't
I'm
know. It
not
doesn't
sure.
matter.
I haven't
Yeah.
heard much about him.
Yeah, I don't watch any of his. It's not like he's a YouTuber that I generally want to watch in this
Right.
church.
But so here, let me give an example actually from the Bible to try and illustrate the point real quick, right? So, in what is it, 18? It is Genesis 18.
Mhm.
God, he visits Abraham and tells him how he's going to give him the child Isaac and all that other kind of stuff,
Mhm.
right? And then he says, I'm not going to hide this thing that I'm going to go do to Sodom and Gomorrah from Abraham. I'm going to tell him about it, right? And so he goes and he tells him about it. And then Abraham starts to say, well, what if there's 50 righteous in the city? Would you destroy the city
Mhm.
with them in it? That's he basically. It's actually Abraham's got some
He
cojones
goes all the way
because
down to one person. I think he goes all the way down the argument to like if it was just one person that was righteous and the whole
well,
entire
he ultimately ends at 10, but
10. I'm
the point
sorry.
is,
Yeah.
yeah, it is whittled.
Yeah.
But it's also like the way he says it. He gets like puffed chest saying, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? That be far from thee. Basically saying like, aren't you supposed to be good, God? Why would you do this? You know what I mean? Which is like, I mean,
And think
assuming God
about that.
exists, that's ballsy, right?
But think about this, right? He was righteous, right? He followed God. He was
Mhm.
favorable in God's eyes, and he recognized a problem with killing
So
everybody.
right now, that's actually exactly my point, though. Right?
Uh-huh.
Notice God provoked him to do this. He's the one who said, "I'm not going to hide from him what I do," and he
Yeah.
provokes him to actually give this response. Now, assuming that this is all divinely inspired, which I believe it is,
Mhm.
um, God is essentially provoking Abraham to have a problem with God's judgment, and
Yeah.
he never chastises him for it. In other words, you're supposed to feel the way that we feel about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the flood, all that other kind of stuff.
Mhm.
That's a righteous thing to do. And also at the same time, God knows what he's doing. There wasn't 10 righteous there. You see, right? You see the both and on there.
Well, I
There
mean,
wasn't 10 righteous, and he expected Abraham to advocate for the 10 righteous. You know what I mean?
here's the
Um,
problem I have with this, right? Okay. Obviously, it was a city. I'm going to argue there were babies and children there. There's no reason to think there wouldn't be any children babies. But the thing is, right? All we're arguing is that anybody born just isn't righteous and worthy of death because you're all born with a sinful nature. Therefore, you're not righteous, right? And then you can be executed. And that's I just find that kind of meaningless in a sense. Because it's like, okay, God, all right. That means that's what he sees. I mean, that's what I don't know. Obviously, we don't know what, from the story. But I think that's why he's probably recognizing, hey, there are innocent people in this city. There are women and children, probably. Obviously, these men were, some weird men trying to rape angels and stuff like that going on in there. But like, it doesn't. When we just say everybody's guilty, then these things about like what it doesn't even matter what they do at this point. Because you're just as guilty being born as being Hitler in God's eyes, unless He offers you His grace and He elects you, and then once you have that grace, then you can freely choose to love him. I don't know. I would use that word freely, but but that it seems meaningless at that point.
I guess I have a different view on that. So when I look at it, it's kind of like God has full authority because he's God. He doesn't even need a reason. And also he has full justification because we're sinful by nature, but he doesn't, which in my opinion is almost like a demonstration of mercy. He's like, I could because I have the authority to do whatever I please. I like to tell a joke. to people to say, you know, God could decide, I will only save every purple panda born on the 7th Thursday of September. And then he'd laugh hysterically as nobody met the qualifications. He has the right to do that because he's God. What are you going to do? Tell him no? Right?
Well, I mean, that's not, I mean, it's like it shows that he doesn't really love everybody and care
if
about
he
everybody.
did that, that's true.
Well, I mean, but it's the same thing as what he's doing now. It's just he's only electing the people that he's preferencing to elect.
Well, so yes and no, right? This is a compatibilism kind of issue. I do believe that determinism and free will are compatible with each other from a philosophical perspective. So I think that while it is true you're determined to have this conversation in opposition of me, I also think it's true that you freely chose it. And a lot of people think that might be a contradiction. Determinism is actually the more common form, compatibilism is actually the more common form of determinism, both amongst theists and atheists. And I personally think it makes the most sense. But
there's no election. But election isn't freely chosen. You have to be chosen in order to have that ability to accept God's grace.
Yeah, so basically what it kind of works out like is, so you are elect from God's perspective, but the mechanism by which that election manifests itself is your own free choice, right? So you could kind of think of it similarly to a book writer. Obviously, the book writer has ordained that the protagonist, you know, breaks the bad guy's neck and saves the day, which is a reference to Ryan George, if anybody's interested in that. But anyways, but at the same time, the reason the hero is heroic is because he willingly, within the confines of the story, of course, goes on the hero's journey. And so the mechanism by which he broke the bad guy's neck and saved the day is his own hero's journey. And they both are compatible with each other. I think it's similar to that, right? So like now, not to say anything about, you know, any sort of eternal destinations or anything like that, but I think that you were, in fact, I won't assume anything. We'll just talk about the conversation. I think you were ordained to have the conversation you're having right now with me before any creation ever happened. But I think the mechanism by which that was accomplished was Skylar's genuine free will. Which
I don't think that makes any sense. It's like it's contradiction. It can't be like preordained. I'll do something and then I freely choose to do it because I didn't choose to do it.
What are the necessary qualifications for a free choice, right? I would say there are two things. Number one, you have the capacity to do otherwise, which of course you do. You could turn off your camera right now, right?
Oh, I could, no. If I were preordained to have this conversation, I do not have the capacity to do otherwise because it would be impossible. I couldn't go against God's preordinations.
Right, but so we got to be specific about what we mean by capacity, right? Because what you just said and what I would agree with in what you just said is you don't have the capacity in the sense that you ultimately won't. But you do have the capacity in the sense that you're physically and mentally capable of doing it, right?
Not if God ordained it. I can't, like, if God ordained I would have this conversation with you, there is nothing physically I can do, even though my body has physical capabilities, right? I'm not seeing, obviously, I touch my hat, I have physical capabilities, but if it's ordained, I don't have the physical capability not to follow that ordination. Am I saying that right? Ordination, is it the right word?
Yeah, no, you
Make
are.
sure I'm not blowing that word, saying the wrong damn thing over and over.
No, and there it's so there is, like I said, in the sense that you ultimately won't do it, that is true. But in the sense that you just said, like, I have the physical capabilities, right? And you have the mental capabilities also. So it's like what's actually being said there is a statement of what you will do, not what you can do, right?
Did I choose to do it or did God choose me to do it?
Yes, and that's the second element, right? Which is
which one?
Did you
What's
both? Right. That's the point. Compatibilism says that they're
contradiction.
compatible with each other, right? So, and that's the second element of a free choice. The first one is, do you have the capacity to do otherwise? Which, by the way, not even all people who believe in libertarian free will agree that you need that, which it makes the compatibilist unique. Because a lot of people who are indeterminist, which means they believe that these things are not compatible with each other, would actually say that the capacity to do otherwise is not necessary for a free choice. Now that gets into the weeds of philosophy, but I think they're wrong. Suffice to say. But nonetheless, so that's the first element is, do you have the capacity to do otherwise? And I would say physically, mentally, emotionally, yes. Only no in the sense that you ultimately will not do it.
Well, I won't do it because I've been chosen to do it. I had no choice in it. Yes, I would have the physical ability to do whatever God ordained. Have the conversation, not have the conversation. I still have the same physical ability. but I have to have the conversation because it was ordained that I would have the conversation. What I've lost is the choice to have the conversation, which is the important part. Not that I physically can't have it or physically can't do it.
So let's just pin that for one moment because I just
All
want
right,
to get to the
please.
second
Yeah,
thing.
sorry. Yeah.
No, you're
Go to your
totally
second
fine.
point. Yeah.
We're gonna return to that because you're bringing up an excellent point. But the second element is, did you do what you genuinely willed to do? Now, it's important to say not wanted to do, because we very often get confused with what free will is and what it isn't. If I put a gun to your head and say do something, I'm actually not violating your free will because you can tell me no. Now that's going to have very serious consequences,
Yeah.
but you have the capacity to tell me no. So did you
Doesn't apply
free?
to God that we're talking about. Because
Well,
God doesn't put a gun and I don't have a choice. God doesn't need the gun. He just makes me do it.
so don't get me wrong, that is true. But the ultimate point of that is to say, in the situation where you listen to the guy with the gun, that's what you willed to do, even if it was a coerced will. And in the situation where you didn't, that's also what you willed to do because you just felt you didn't want to be coerced, right? So the two
Well,
elements there then are: do you have the
yeah.
capacity to do otherwise, and did it come from a genuine act of your own will?
But that
I
will
think
was
both of those are
decreed by
compatible with
God.
God's ordination.
No. But the will to do something was what was ordained. He ordained me to want to do this video conversation with you.
Right.
So
No, that I had no problem with that. I think, but notice you still willed. So like the question
I
becomes,
experienced the will. I experienced it. I didn't choose it.
well, do you ever really choose your wills in that sense, right? Because like if
Fair,
we go,
but different point. We're not talking about God on that, right? Yeah,
fair enough.
naturalism. You're right. There may be some. I haven't studied that enough, but under the God thing, though, that will was ordained for me. So was so. I don't. There is no choice any step of the way, right? Capability means obviously absolutely nothing, CJ, because the capability. If I don't have the ability to use that capability, which I don't have the ability because I am willed to do a particular behavior.
Yeah, I think disagree with that. I think it's so. Have you ever heard? This is probably annoying, but if you
It's
have
okay.
heard it, then have you ever heard the thing where somebody will say, "Well, what if I did something else?" And the response is, "Then God's knowledge would have been different." You ever heard that one before?
Yeah, but I think there's okay. I think there's a difference in how if okay. There's one thing if God started creation, right? He just got the ball rolling. He's like, all right, here you go. I'm not going to choose your wills. I'm not going to do any of this. He may know what's going to happen, right? But he didn't choose our wills, right? He knows how we will choose and all that kind of stuff. But I think that's saying something very different, right? You at least then are culpable, like in my opinion, would be culpable for your own actions because you chose to do these things. He didn't will you. He didn't make you do it. Both situations you have capability, right? You would agree both situations are the same as far as capacity, capability to do something.
Yeah.
But in the other one now you're not being forced. Your will's not his will's not being forced upon you. And you get to freely choose and love God, and everybody gets an opportunity at grace.
Well, and in a way, I think everybody is, right? So, in fact, let me actually kind of say this entire mechanism that I think is ordained is ultimately the freedom of will, and then there's the question of where the will originates, and that is another question in and of itself. But if I have a situation where let's say you have an all-knowing God, and He knows what Skylar's going to do if he gives Skylar free will, and He also knows all the counterfactuals of, if I don't give Skylar free will, or if I make Skylar born in Albany, New York, as opposed to wherever it is that you actually were born, which if it was Albany, it'd be hilarious. But
I get your point. Yeah.
Right. So he knows all that, but what he decided is, I'm going to give Skylar free will, knowing what he'll do with it.
Yeah.
In that scenario, remember, he had the opportunity to give or to not give the free will, and he already knew the consequences of it. Did he ordain what you're going to do? I would argue yes in that instance.
I think you have an argument there, right? I don't necessarily completely disagree with. But somehow, all right, this is just my opinion, okay, right? It feels better, that decision, right? Like, it's like, hey, you know what? I gave you the chance. I knew I was going to do. I think people could make arguments against that too, and be like, I could make arguments against that and be like, that's bad also. Like I would, in fact, I have before, right? To be fair,
Right.
but I just feel like if I were to choose between the two, like if I had two options here, and it was the no God wasn't an option, right? I'm going to like the one where people get to actually, and I think you don't deal with the problem of evil as much. I think the Calvinism aspect where you're preordaining a lot of these things, I think it makes God look worse. At least with this one, it's like, hey, these human beings, man, they're coming up with some evil things to do on their own, opposed to God being sovereign and all these evil things I'm referring to as evil are being done, right, and created in a sense by God. He gave the will for whatever most horrible thing you can think of X for someone to do, like Jeffrey Dahmer. That's a great example. Too.
See,
You know what I'm
I
saying?
ultimately, yeah. And so not even necessarily disagreeing with what you said,
Yeah.
because I actually largely, and like I said, being compatibilist, that's one of the key elements of my philosophical view here is that I think these things are not interchangeable. Sorry, they are compatible. I don't know why I'm losing that word. It's literally in the name, compatibilism. Anyways, but in that instance, so I don't see a difference in the sense of determinism. I do see a difference in the sense that like there's hard determinism and the soft determinism of whether or not God is forcing you to do what you do. Martin Luther, for example, felt that humans were, the direct quote, he said, "We are dragged along by chains into our sin." I don't agree with that. John Calvin, who is obviously famous for Calvinism, would be more on my side of things. We have he said that ultimately there's no distinction biblically between allowing, or there's no distinction theologically, we'll say, because it's not just limited to the Bible. I think the Sikhi and all these other guys who believe in a monotheistic sovereign God would have the same issue. There's ultimately no difference between allowance and ordaining, because allowance is ordaining if you're in the position that God's in, right? So while I would agree with you that it's like, okay, we have the genuine choice there, I think the point is ultimately that, yes, and God ordained you to have that genuine choice. He knew what Dahmer would do if he gave Dahmer free will, but he gave it to him anyway, right? Which means that he had some sort of a purpose. Maybe the purpose is simply to give Dahmer free will. That's possible. That's a different discussion, right? I think it's greater than that, but I do think that's an element of it, is to create a genuinely free creature. But you can't get out of that. He ordained before anything had ever happened what Dahmer did, because he could have not given the free will. And this is the other interesting element about it, right? You could have free will given in another sense. And what I mean by that is like, so I'm up here talking right now. If I was born mute, that would not be the case, but my free will would not be violated. I still have a free will. I just simply can't talk to you because I'm mute, right? So, you do have instances there where it's like that ordination is still seemingly going to fall ultimately on God, but there is still free active choice involved in it. And the question at that point only becomes, why has God ordained things as he has? Which is ultimately, which puts you firmly in the Calvinist position, I think. And obviously,
No, I was going to say, and I got to wrap up here because I want to talk to you for like 5 minutes after we go off, if you have a second to talk.
Definitely.
But I think what somebody might also, as you were talking about this, the idea of the two different kinds of what we're saying, I think someone might be able to also make the argument of best possible worlds with a non-Calvinist one, right?
Yeah.
You could be like, hey, well, of all possible worlds with free will, this was the one where the maximum amount of souls were saved, even though you have this certain amount of evil, or a certain amount of things, opposed to you're really just controlling everything. You're controlling the amount of evil in the world. You're controlling the amount of people that are going to be saved. As far as it goes. But let me give you the last word on this, or if you want to say talk about something else, or any last words that way. Because I do unfortunately have to get going. I got to get to bed soon. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, you're fine.
I got to get up early. Yeah.
Yeah, you're I think a whole 2 hours ahead of me, so I totally hear it. I guess the only thing I would say in that element is I think that I think you ultimately will always run into let me rephrase this.
Mhm.
In my opinion, the only actual answer to the problem of evil, if one exists, will ultimately put you either at soft or hard determinism,
Yeah.
which is why I think Calvinism makes the most sense. Now, there are different versions of that. Like I said, there's the Lutheran version of, not Lutheran as in the church, but Martin Luther himself, of, us being dragged by chains into sin, which I do not agree with, although The Bondage of the Will is a great read if anybody wants to read it. And then there is the compatibilist version that we saw pass through the Reformation through guys like Calvin and Knox and so on, which I think makes more sense. But it does ultimately still put us in a position of God ordained these evil acts for some ultimately holy purpose. At least one of those holy purposes is that human beings have a genuine capacity for free will, amongst other things. And they're also in, I understand that you'll probably disagree with this, being a non-theist, or no, sorry, being a non-Christian.
Mhm.
I want to make sure I represent you accurately. But I think that allows me and some of the people I've done personal witness to take a certain level of solace in what happens negatively. And this is a very small example because I haven't, thank God, gone through a whole bunch of trauma. But my cat, who I was closer to than any animal I've ever owned, passed away in 2020. It kind of broke my heart a little bit, right? And there was a level of solace I could take there in that ultimately God ordained the death of this cat at this point in time, and he was only 7, very young, for an ultimately holy purpose, which that doesn't, no, it's not that it stops hurting at that point, but it does allow me to kind of sit there and think, okay, he knows what's best for me. He knows what's best for the cat. He knows what's best for the world. And ultimately, at the end of this all, when I see that looking back, I'll be able to say genuinely, glory to God, right? I don't think you get that unless you have a faith that God has ordained all evil things for an ultimately holy purpose. But I could understand if you're a non-Christian why that might not suffice. Although to be fair, I have noticed it does seem to me to be a little bit more compatible with, or not compatible, but a little bit more. Sorry, I word things terribly sometimes. The point is, in my experience, atheists are much more open to my understanding of the problem of evil and to a Calvinist understanding of the problem of evil than they are to the straightforward Frank Turek free will arguments, which for the most part, a lot of times they say make no sense, but I'll let you speak for yourself on that.
No. I think that's a good place to wrap it up, man. I appreciate what you had to say tonight. I think this was a good dialogue, and we can always continue this in the future. We'll have more. We can have anytime you want to have me on the show, bro. Just let me know, and I can come over. Absolutely. It's really not a big deal. We had a lot of things going on. I had a Florida. We were supposed to do this. I had a hurricane that came through Florida, and then I didn't get power back all the way till I think it was Saturday night, late Saturday night. I got it. It was like Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. It was a lot of days without power, but thank goodness it's back on. But no, I appreciate you hosting me. I appreciate the good dialogue. Folks in the audience over there on the comments, be a little more charitable to me. I'm not that bad of a guy. I'm nice. I'm a nice guy. I know you guys think I'm a bad guy, but I'm a decent human being. Can be nice.
Yeah, and I've always very much enjoyed having these dialogues with you. I think you're a very good guy. And also, this is ultimately a theology and an apologetics channel. So
yeah,
I want to start making more of a habit than I have of getting guys like yourself, Knock, Dr. Josh, if you'd want to be on, just people who don't agree with me basically on this channel, because that's the entire point, right? If I'm just sitting here talking to an echo chamber, then all I'm doing is fueling the fire. Yeah, so I appreciate this, and I probably will hit you up in the near future about a second talk and third and fourth and so on, as long as you'll have me, right?
Yeah. Let me know. Come on my channel anytime. It'll be fun, and I'll come on here anytime.
For sure. Well, with that, friends, we've been going actually longer than we intended, which is good. And so we're going to go ahead and wrap it up here. I appreciate you guys tremendously. If you liked this video, please remember to like and share the video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so, and hit that bell to get notified every time we go live. You have full permission, friends, if you felt any of this was beneficial, to clip it. That even applies to my enemies, by the way. Enemies. But nonetheless, you can certainly clip it, get it around. If you guys have any specific criticisms or commentaries or anything like that, please do leave them in the in the live chat below. Anything you thought that I did poorly, anything you thought that Skylar did poorly, anything like that. I only ask that you do so in a charitable and honest manner, but I always want to hear the criticisms that people have, whether they be good or bad. So with all that being said, friends, we're going to go ahead and get out of here. I'll have an open room tomorrow night. It's our Sabbath night open mic. We missed last week because of some issues I was dealing with, but this week we'll be able to go. By the way, if you want to show up there, Skylar, you certainly can. And yeah, if the Lord wills and tarries, we'll be seeing you guys here soon tomorrow for a Sabbath night open mic. Shalom.